Hello and welcome to India's World. Today we are going to discuss the crisis in Egypt. Hundreds of supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood have been killed by the army and thousands have been injured. Their spiritual leader, Muhammad Badi, has been arrested. The Muslim Brotherhood, in turn, has killed some policemen and burnt about 40 churches. A month-long state of emergency has been declared in the country and several areas are under curfew. It is clear that the Egyptian army, which overthrew an elected but unpopular President Mohamed Morsi, has not been able to find a way out of the present crisis. There's even a possibility now that the army will declare the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization and ban it. Meanwhile, the erstwhile President Hosni Mubarak is being set free from jail. It seems incongruous that while a democratically elected president continues to be in jail, a former dictator, Hosni Mubarak, against whom the Egyptian uprising took place in the first instance, will walk free. The questions we need to answer are, is Egypt returning to autocratic rule? What will be the long-term consequences of the crackdown on the Muslim Brotherhood? What is the way forward in Egypt? To answer these questions, I have with me a very distinguished panel of experts. We have with us Ambassador Arundhati Ghose. She is India's former ambassador to Egypt and also Indian ambassador to the UN Conference on Disarmament. Then we have Ambassador Kanwal Sibal. He's India's former foreign secretary. You are also Indian ambassador to Egypt, a formidable diplomat. Welcome to the show. And we have my old friend Javed Naqvi, who's worked for Gulf News, Khaleej Times, follows the region closely, and is the India correspondent of Pakistan's #1 newspaper, The Dawn. So I welcome all of you to the show. Let me begin with you, Ambassador Ghose. The last time we discussed Egypt on this show, you had justified the intervention of the Egyptian army, saying that it represented people's anger. People's anger because President Mohamed Morsi was snatching away their revolution and taking it in a different direction, an Islamist direction. Now, have you changed your opinion since then, after the army crackdown on the Muslim Brotherhood and the number of people they've killed?
Well, my opinion can't be based on what happened a month ago, because things have developed. If the interim government has started working, the work, for example, on the Constitution, a draft has already been sent to the President. Some indications of what is going to be in the new Constitution is there. They are, for example, on the issue of the Sharia. They have said it will be the main source of law to keep Al-Noor and so forth in the roadmap plan. So there is work which is going on behind the scenes. But I think that when the military, when Al-Sisi asked for the Tamarod and the National Salvation Front to support any action they took against terrorists, there was a response of support. But I think that support is probably dribbling away because of the methods used to kill civilians. Even if the Brotherhood has provoked by not taking up any of the offers of peaceful exit from the camps, nothing. Even if they incited people with taking protesters into the camps, the spreading of the camps, settling down, building brick walls on bridges, whatever. The people who got killed were civilians, and the numbers were very large. So the Muslim Brotherhood's tactics worked. They got the Western media focused on that. But it has got, I think, the protesters who supported, the ones I support, supported the military at that stage to start having doubts. Now, I have no idea how they will react to this possible release of Mubarak. One will have to see what their newspapers say.
But they're saying he might be put under house arrest, so let's see.
Well, there are so many charges against him. I cannot, because he already cannot leave the country. His assets are frozen.
Okay, but we'll come to Hosni Mubarak later. Let me just go to Ambassador Sibal. How disastrous do you think has been the army's violence against Muslim Brotherhood? Because when you kill 1,000 of your own people, they're Egyptians after all, they may disagree with you, they may have a different perspective, it can have disastrous consequences. What could be these consequences?
Two, three things. One is that during this so-called Arab Spring turmoil in Egypt, the army was looked upon as the guarantor of safety. It has prestige. All the sides were supporting the armed forces. There was no animus against them. They stayed out. So it had, despite the history of dominating the polity for so many decades, the army had not lost respect of the people. Now you have a situation where the army has got involved in politics deeply. I still maintain that it was a coup that took place. And the fact that it is a coup, it was a coup, is now supported by the actions that the army has taken. They've shot at people, they have killed people. Whatever the nature of the provocation, if the armed forces of a country start shooting at their own civilians, the repercussions of that internally and externally are very grave. So the army has become very controversial. It has got caught in a hugely complex process, and they have really no capacity, no means, no experience to bring the political quarreling classes together on a common platform. Okay. Now if they go ahead and ban the Muslim Brotherhood, then they'll be reverting to what effectively has been the position for so many decades. And that's not going to help solve the problem, because the election showed that the Muslim Brotherhood has support. They got elected in a reasonably fair election. So the country really is polarized. In that situation, I'm afraid the armed forces have bitten more than they can chew, and they're going to have a lot of problems down the road.
Javed, do you think Egypt has moved from being a flawed democracy to a military-backed authoritarian government, or do you think it's too early to draw that conclusion?
I'm not sure that it was ever, in any sense, a normal democracy.
Flawed democracy.
Flawed democracy, of course. There are many that exist in that region, but Iran is another one for that matter. But what I would see it as a regression from 1973, 40 years to date almost, when everybody got together, led by Egypt, and the quarry was Israel, and the issue was Palestine, and the weapon was oil. So 1973 to 2013, it's 40 years. It's 40 years we've been dismantling that threat. And there were several occasions, several methods were used. Not the least, of course, was the co-option of Egypt in 1978 when Sadat visited, so forth. So at that time, we were not talking about Muslim Brotherhood or the threat of this and that. Everybody was.
You're running out of time in this segment, so no, go on.
So, very quickly, I think there is. We should look also at the precedents. This is not the first time the army has gone and subverted an election. Okay. Algeria was the first, where Muslims, the Brotherhood, the radicals, won it flat out, and they were stolen. The election was stolen by the army, and the West had applauded.
Okay, we need to take a break at this juncture. We'll be back again with this interesting discussion after the break. Don't go away. Welcome back. We're discussing the unfolding crisis in Egypt. Before we went on the break, Ambassador Ghose, you wanted to say something.
Yes, one thing we must be very clear. It is easy to say it was the armed forces who shot and killed the Muslim Brotherhood members who were protesting. It was not. It was the police. That, I think, was a mistake made, and it's under the Ministry of Interior. It's not the Defense Ministry. Mistake made by the interim government, because the police in the Mubarak time was hated. They were hated because they were so rough.
Okay, but tell me,
no, I'm making a difference. Yeah. Because we're talking about possibility of a military rule. If there was so much power in the Ministry of Defense, headed by Al-Sisi, this would not, there would be a problem. But
okay, can the Egyptian state now pull back and say, look, a mistake has been made? pull back? Or do you think they will not be allowed to pull back by the Muslim Brotherhood itself? Because for the first time it's got martyrs, it's got an organizing principle, it's got shaheeds, and it can organize protests all over Egypt with much greater fervor.
Two points I want to make. One is not only all over Egypt. We've had protests in Indonesia, we've had protests in Bangladesh. Egypt has closed its embassy in Bangladesh. So it's spreading the brotherhood thing. But I do not think that the brotherhood is, because there is a fight between, as I said last time, the younger reformists and the older hardliners. They're not splitting, but there are problems between the two. And this is coming out in two different voices. One saying, yes, conciliation, one saying no. So once you put the leaders into jail, Bari in jail, Khairat al-Shatar's business has all been frozen. You've got, so funding is closing down. Qatar is not giving any more money. I think they will, if the younger ones come in, they will lie low for a bit, regroup, and then we have to see down the road. But at the moment, it is the army's decision, to either back down because they have the very bad experience of SCAF, the year between Mubarak and Morsi, which the military ran and disastrously. They clearly cannot govern. And the people on the street got them out. The people on the street can do that again because they cannot do it without popular support. One last point, Bharat, if I may, is Sinai. The military is being challenged in Sinai in a very serious way because the jihadis are there, and I suspect it is the Al-Qaeda in, I don't even know if it's in the Arab Peninsula, in Iraq, or in the Maghreb, AQIM, AQAP, one of these formations is setting down roots in Sinai.
Okay. Master Sibal, do you think the violence against Morsi's supporters will unite all the Islamists, not only Muslim Brotherhood, but other Islamists, and building a secular, inclusive Egypt will become that much more difficult now?
Well, you know, the Arab world is divided on this. You have Qatar, who was earlier very active, now having had to withdraw because the Saudis and the Kuwaitis and the UAE have come into the fray and have offered billions of dollars to the present regime and are very happy that the Muslim Brotherhood has been ousted. And then you have Turkey, which is taking the contrary position and is very unhappy at what has happened, because what they want to protect against is the possibility, not that it is likely, of the Turkish military getting encouragement from what's happened in Egypt and then targeting the present Islamist kind of government in Turkey. So the Syria is very happy at what has happened. So the Islamic world is divided. So I don't see that kind of a coming together of the Islamist forces in the region as a whole and presenting a bigger challenge in Egypt, which virtually could lead to some kind of a civil war, because you would have a situation where these kind of people within Egypt have the external support of the Arab world, and the armed forces will have, in that situation, the support of the West as well as Israel. Okay. But I don't think that this is a likely scenario at this point in time.
Okay. Javed, in retrospect, do you think it was too much to expect that the Egyptian army, which has no experience of democracy, army men know nothing about democracy, would actually usher in democracy? So was it, the whole situation, was it front-loaded towards failure?
Well, whenever you have a guided democracy, this is not the first time. I think in your neighborhood we had a youth Khan trying the same thing. It failed, and so you have said it right. But the question is, the armed forces today are very different from the armed forces under Jamal Nasser, which is when the armed forces came together, and they have been weeded out of the vestiges of the Islamists, because it was Islam bully who gunned down Sadat from inside a tank during a parade. So under Mubarak and others, they went about very systematically to get this. So army is actually a very hostile component vis-a-vis the popular surge, which unfortunately or fortunately for them happens to be the Brotherhood. So army is in a bind. It is a secularist army, but almost fanatically secularist. It does not want to see, it's almost like the Central Asian republics. If you go there, they suspect my beard. So they've forgotten Lenin and Trotsky and everybody. And
they had a slightly different beard though. More like mine.
So the question is, the army in that capacity has cut itself off from a very the rest of the people who are debating Islam, moderate Islam, extremist Islam, Coptics, secularism. The army has now become a fundamentalist secularist thing.
Okay. We need to take a break at this juncture. We'll be back again with this interesting discussion after the break. Don't go away. Welcome back. We're discussing the unfolding events in Egypt. Ambassador Sibal, do you think that the US plans for Egypt have gone awry? Or do you think Washington DC will support any regime that does not repudiate the peace treaty with Israel?
I think you're right. Their plans have gone awry. They have been in a very difficult situation when the whole revolution started as a democratic country, and some of their own institutions were pushing for democracy in Egypt and pushing for the ouster of Mubarak and all that. So they were compelled to support the change in Egypt. Then they gave a long rope to the Islamic Brotherhood, saying that this represents political Islam, and this is the road ahead where you can combine Islam and democracy, and Muslim Brotherhood, having come into the democratic process, is holding hope for the future. Then the Muslim Brotherhood leaders have been ousted and jailed and this and that. It is evidently a military coup, but the Americans can't say it's a military coup because then their legislation comes into play and they will then not have to give aid and everything else, which they can't afford to do. And you're absolutely right. At the back of it all is somehow to make sure that the basic treaty which has held peace in the Arab world for so many years between Israel and Egypt does not get disturbed, and that America continues to have influence with the armed forces, though they're highly embarrassed because they cannot accept what has happened on the ground, whether it's the police or the armed forces who are shooting at civilian population. So I'm afraid the United States is in a terrible bind, and it's not very clear how they're going to handle the situation satisfactorily.
Okay, Javed, let's take the case of Saudi Arabia. They've vociferously supported this violence against the Muslim Brotherhood. Is it because the Muslim Brotherhood is a symbol of resistance, a rallying point in the Saudi kingdom itself against a Wahhabi monarchy? Because the Saudis have not been above using Islam of a particular kind to create riots between Shias and Sunnis or to spread Islamic fundamentalism in the rest of the world.
They're terrified. The entire Gulf, from United Arab Emirates, Qatar may be the joker in the pack, just because this is, as you said, it has pulled back somewhat in this whole conundrum. But it's the Saudis and the Emirates who have taken the lead in supporting this regime against the Muslim Brotherhood. So, and now what does that leave Iran, Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, which was the most hawkish against Iran, for example, Abu Dhabi definitely. They have got two fronts now. One is Iran, the other is Muslim Brotherhood. Muslim Brotherhood is that much more difficult to weed out because it comes from the majority Sunni sect. And they could be like the army in pre-Mubarak Egypt. They could be there in the Air Force, they could be there anywhere, because that is the way they were reared. So I think the Gulf is really terrified at what has happened in Egypt.
Master Ghose, India's expressed concern over the violence in Egypt, just expressed concern, nothing more, it hasn't condemned it, and has asked for all parties to engage in dialogue. Do you think this is an adequate response to the developments in Egypt? Do you think we could have done more?
Like
said
what?
more?
Like
Condemned
what?
the violence? Instead of saying we are concerned about it. What does it
Well,
mean?
which violence? Because
latest.
both sides have been violent. There are things, we of course hosted
Surely the state's
President
violence.
Morsi. We hosted President Morsi. We had hoped for a stable relationship. I believe we were in contact with the leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood, all these people who are now arrested or whatever. So there is a loss of your investment that you had made, a political investment. But at the same time, the kind of things which are coming out, the ties between the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas, what exactly was the entire thing? I don't think the government even looked at it. So whatever it is, at the moment they're being more than cautious.
Okay.
So I think they are taking as neutral a stand, saying that the violence must stop because
And dialogue must begin.
and dialogue. And no, dialogue is, again, one of those words like in Afghanistan, reconciliation, integration. Dialogue with whom? The younger brotherhood?
Okay.
The existing people who are in jail? What is the, you've got to be very
We
careful.
got to be careful. Last word to you, Master Sibal. How important is Egypt for India? Because the developments in Egypt clearly have repercussions in West Asia, where a huge diaspora, Indian diaspora, lives and works.
Well, to my mind, we are still in that mental phase of Egypt being the fulcrum of the Arab world, largest population, biggest country, huge cultural influence. However, Egypt has never been an economic player. And the real players in the Arab world are those with money. And they have influenced not only movements in the Arab world, but internationally too. So I think the importance of Egypt, I won't want to underestimate its importance, but let's not exaggerate it in terms of what happens on the ground there, actually a signal for some kind of of consequences in the Arab world as a whole. For a long time, Egypt was out of the equation after the peace treaty with Israel, and it was brought back into the main fold. In the Arab League, they don't have much of an influence. It's Saudi Arabia that actually, in the OIC, they don't have influence. So I think we have to have a nuanced view about the real importance of Egypt in terms of shaping the environment in the Arab world, though of course I will not say that Egypt is irrelevant, it's not. So to that extent, I think the events in Egypt and what is happening there do not have any direct repercussions on our interests,
So our
barring of
reaction
course
was
our
all right.
bilateral relations.
Our reaction was all right. You
I think it was all right.
Okay, with that, we've run out of time. I thank you for coming here and sharing your views on Egypt with our viewers. That's all we have for you today. We'll be back again next week with another interesting issue. Till then, goodbye.